You're listening to the Valley Current.
Hello,
Hey,
Jack.
Len. Welcome into the Valley Current.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you for coming and making it on a Monday. We had a busy day on Friday with a court hearing, so unfortunately that blasted into my schedule of various podcasts, so nothing's going to get published except on a delayed basis. But thank you for making your Monday afternoon. I've got a few questions for you. As you know, we don't script any of this, so it comes as kind of rapid fire. Do you think that what's happening is the second phase that we've talked about? We talked about whether there's going to be a worse second sort of pandemic phase where things are actually worse than what we saw in March, April, and May. Now that we're in June, July, and I guess soon August, or do you think this is all part of one big, gigantic phase?
Yes, I think the latter is more likely. I don't know that the divisions of these events into phases has any value other than when one sees that the rates skyrocket or descend rapidly. But to divide it into phases, I don't know how valuable that is.
Well, we know there was some data from the 1918 pandemic that suggested there was like a bump and then a downplay and then another big bump and then a downplay and then a smaller bump, almost like three phases. And I don't know whether things are so different in the 21st century that you'd say, well, whatever happened 102 years ago, that's 102 years ago. No real jet planes, no airports, or I don't think there were airports back then. Maybe there were a few airports. 1918, the Wright brothers had discovered Wright brothers had discovered air travel, but I don't know that air travel was that predominant. And in general, people didn't move around as much, I don't think, right?
No, of course they didn't.
Right?
But I don't think that, I think they're simply waves of occurrences. And whether they're defined as waves or phases, there's still hopefully an accurate representation of the occurrence of various events. And I don't know what the value of those names are, other than, as I said, knowing when the numbers go up or down.
Right. Well, comparatively, it looks like the numbers are still going up, right?
That's right. They're definitely going up, all attributable to the failure of people to do the three simple-minded things that we all know need to be done.
Well, remind us what the three are. I know one's a mask for sure, right?
The masks, not only the mask, but to wear them properly.
Right.
It's another problem. I see pictures of people with masks that are draped over their nose and mouth, but with lots of openings where the mask goes over the bridge of the nose. When that should be closed, the professional masks made for surgeons and for use in hospitals has a bendable metal band in that area that you simply squeeze over the bridge of your nose to close that open area that would exist without the presence of that bendable band.
Right. Even this mask is kind of trivial. It's got a piece of metal in it, but I don't know if it really bends as much as it should. You know, this guy, this is like a standard inexpensive.
If you squeeze it and it lays on your nose, then that's what it should be doing.
Right. But I think they have ones that are a little tighter, kind of they're a little more firm in the way in which they enclose. Because your point is, you got to wear a mask properly, and you probably can't even really do what people do, which is they often drop it down. What I see is a lot of people walking around like this these days to say, look, I'm kind of half in, half out. I see that kind of thing, which is, look, I'm trying to be politically correct, but I think I still need to talk. There's no one here in my office, so I could do this. But if there was someone here, there are a lot of people like, I don't want to talk through a mask. I don't want to do that. Right?
Well, you can have a photograph of your face blown up.
Right.
And then you cut off the parts of the photograph that are not covered by a mask.
Right.
And the remainder can then be pasted or glued over your masks so that people can see a nose and a mouth, although the mouth is not moving.
Right.
At least they get a
sense,
feel for an accurate look at your face.
Right. And I saw someone with a very expensive clear plastic version that looked more like you really could still see the movement of the lips.
Yeah, I think I've seen that also, but I don't know how well that protects against the presence of things as small as virus particles.
Right. I mean, you wouldn't go on a plane these days even with a mask, I don't think, right? Would you?
Well, I certainly wouldn't, because I'm in one of the highest risk classes of people.
Right. But let's say you were in your 60s like I am. Would you go on a plane? Like, my brother's in trouble medically for other reasons. He's in the hospital. I'm not even sure I could visit him. But conceptually, if I were to fly to Tampa, that's about a 9-hour flight with connections, because you have to wait in an airport. Airports are probably not the best places on earth either. But generally speaking, would you say, hey, if I was in my 60s and my brother were ill and I could visit him, would you be jumping on a 2 flights? Because of course there's no direct flight to Tampa. So you have to go 2 flights. You have to stop either in Dallas or somewhere in the middle of the country, and then spend a couple of hours in an airport waiting for a second flight. Now, they require you to wear a mask, but I'm kind of curious, before we do the second and the third requirements, would you do that flight in your 60s with a mask on? Or would you say it's just too risky?
I would say it's much too risky, and I would tell my brother why I was not visiting him, for the fear of acquiring this deadly disease.
And then you could transmit it to him, which would really make him far worse, and it'd make the hospital worse, right?
Of course, and if he's an intelligent brother, and I assume he is, he will understand that. And you can communicate by telephone and by visual means,
right.
Zoom or Skype or whatever is handy.
Right.
So that being by his bedside, although that's ideal, the way around it, as I just described, I think is adequate. And a loving brother would understand that.
Right. I think we're all getting into that mode, but certainly the airlines want to get people back on flights, and you have to imagine that they're hurting for business and literally just want to get travelers back in action, but it may just be too early for that at this point.
Well, of course they want more business. What they should be doing, and some of them are, is helping to encourage people to wear masks, stay 6 feet apart,
right,
wash your hands,
right,
and to encourage people to do that whether they're flying or not.
Right. But it also, in some ways, even this notion of being 6 feet apart, it's against the very idea of a shelter-in-place quarantine, because people are going out and they are sitting at restaurant tables and they are pretending like they're 6 feet apart. They may be more like 4 feet apart or 3 feet apart. And you got to believe that there is some transmission still going on as a result of that, right?
Well, of course, even 6 feet apart in a room that is indoors is often insufficient.
Right.
Because of leakage around masks, or the the ability of virus particles, not only corona, but all others, to remain in the air for long periods of time, depending on how they were dispersed. If they were dispersed by a cough or a sneeze, or by sibilants, that is, words with sounds in them that allow for the expression of saliva in tiny, minuscule droplets.
Right.
That allow for their dispersal to remain in the air for long periods of time, and as a consequence of that, for longer distances as they get moved around.
Right.
Like smoke from a cigarette, you can imagine it to be something like that. Smoke particles are probably at the same dimension as some of the smaller virus particles.
Right. So you've been totally quarantined now for probably going on 90 days? Pretty much?
Yes, I don't know that you could call it a total quarantine, because I do go to the local post office, but I stay in my car until there are no people around. And so that there's no risk involved there. And also I go shopping at the local grocery every 4 to 5 weeks. And I outfit myself in the latest haute couture, which means a raincoat, a baseball cap, gloves, and a mask. The gloves and mask are surgical quality.
And do you put an extra little plastic shield like the way some dentists do?
No, I don't do that. But what I do in addition to that is, once I leave the grocery store, my bottle of 70% alcohol is sitting beside me in my car, and I wash my gloved hands and my bare face after removal of the mask with 70% alcohol, and the steering wheel of the car, and sometimes the outside of the packaging or of the paper packaging of some of the things that I buy.
Right, and you're probably believing, as you sit there, that you have a certain viral load, as we all do. It's just not at the density to become medically significant, right? Is that the way you think of it?
Yeah, yes, and you make a very important point that's not emphasized in the discussions that I've seen,
right,
in the various media, and that's what's called the multiplicity of infection.
Right.
I don't know whether you know that term.
Yes, I do.
Good.
But explain it for the audience.
You're one of the few people who do understand. And the multiplicity of infections means the number of virus particles that on average are required to initiate a full-blown disease, COVID-19 or any other virus caused disease. And those numbers can vary significantly. For example, if it may require 100 virions or virus particles to cause a disease, or it might require 1,000, 10,000, or 1 million, or even more. We don't know. In the case of COVID-19, at least I've not seen any data on that at all, and I doubt that I will, because the only way to determine that is too risky.
Right.
The other problem is the failure to understand how the tests themselves are reliable or not reliable, because of the failures to test the tests by independent sources for safety, specificity, reproducibility, and overall ability to work. And I've not seen any data on the alleged tests that are now available. And furthermore, because there are more than one test available, how the tests compare in respect to their results.
Right.
So it's very complicated business. In any case, even the use of a probe that enters your nasal cavity, as they do in most of these tests, I think all of them now, is risky.
Right.
Because when they probe that area in the back of the nasal cavity, if there are 100 virions sitting there and the surface, that mucosal surface is scratched with a probe, then that could increase the likelihood of becoming sick with whatever virus numbers are present on that part of your nasal cavity.
Right.
That has not been looked at, and it's clearly a risk. So I'm very skeptical about the ironclad reliability that people are placing on these test results. It's not only the separation that's required and the mask use that's required, but it's also the unknowns about the accuracy and specificity and reproducibility also of these tests, lot to lot. The tests are made in lots.
Right.
And I see no data as is required on vaccine licensing. You must show lot after lot after lot. I think 3 consecutive lots, at least that's the way it used to be when I was involved in vaccine development. You must show same positive results on 3 consecutive independent lots of vaccine production.
Right.
That should apply to tests as well.
Well, I would have thought there would be standards by now for this sort of thing. That is, when you're dealing with this sort of thing, people would all agree these are the scientific and appropriate sort of statistical standards. Is it surprising to you that that does not appear to be the case?
Well, I don't think it is the case.
Right. Why?
Because the standards that you accurately identify and that should be used by an independent organization like the FDA, who licenses these things, is, as far as I know, only recommendations, not having the ironclad requirement that the present tests be licensed by the FDA, who have independently tested the tests for the variables that I have described a couple of times now.
Right.
I don't see any of that data. It's only recommendations. Well, when you only allow manufacturers to use recommendations for the testing of their test kits, you run the serious risk of their not rigorously applying what is required to guarantee that the tests work, because the motive is to make money and to produce as many tests as you possibly can in order to meet the demand. So doing circles around the requirements is a very tempting opportunity to sell more tests and sell them quickly without spending the time and money to make sure that they are what we all hope they would be.
Well, it seems inevitable that we'll probably have lots of tests that fail and lots of sort of corrections over time. Maybe it'll take years to actually get a test that actually has some real reliability, right? We're kind of in a trial and error mode, more or less.
Yes, but look at the reliability. Look at the numbers that you see that people think are ironclad and 100% accurate that appear on TV screens, in the print media and elsewhere.
Right.
That is very, very suspicious. And to rely on those numbers, as is being done for future planning and present planning, is a real concern.
Right. So do you take your temperature every once in a while? I'm just curious, to go back to your almost perfect quarantine. It's not exactly perfect, but it sounds as perfect as anyone I know. I mean, I've talked to hundreds of people and they more or less are not really in quarantine. They're kind of living their life as though, yeah, I've got to be careful, but hey, I'm going to go out and do a bunch of stuff. And if a restaurant is open, I'm going to order a meal and sit outside and have a glass of wine. Of course, the server comes up to them. Server has a mask on, but they're still talking through their mask, and the mask may not fit perfectly, and they're not 6 feet apart when they're talking because the server's got to be within earshot, and they're not using a megaphone, and they're not using a loudspeaker. So you haven't done any of those things. You've lived a pretty quarantined existence now for, I'm going to say, probably close to 90 days, maybe over 90 days, right?
Yes, well, what you described as the behavior that you have seen by others is precisely why this wave is going to continue well into the future, certainly into next year. And the complaints that people will make about having to do these common sense things that we described earlier people are going to resist doing that. This pandemic will continue at various levels of concern until it will peter out of its own accord after so many people become positive that the virus will have fewer and fewer people who will be susceptible.
Well, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this notion of petering out of a virus, because you have viewed viruses under appropriate high-powered microscopes, right? You've actually seen what these viruses look like, even though they're minuscule. Like you and I talked about, a molecule of a virus is far smaller than a fart. I think you and I have talked about that on the show. The gas from a fart, from gas passing, the molecules of that gas are much larger. You can't see those very well in real life either. But I think you said, a virus is like a fraction of the molecule of a fart, right?
Well, you can also think of it in the following terms: finding a single golf ball somewhere in your house. That would be typical of the comparative sizes of a cell that's required by a virus or viruses to replicate.
Yes.
And the likelihood of replication to occur, whether you need one golf ball in your garage or in your bedroom, or 10 or 100 or 1,000 to allow for clinical manifestations of a disease to occur, gives you some idea of the size of a virus particle.
Right.
The other thing you have to understand that virus particles generally replicate in the host cell every 20 minutes.
Right.
So that 1 or 2 or 10 virus particles attach to a cell and then insert their nucleic acid into the cell in 20 minutes will produce, let's say, 20,000 or 100,000 additional virions or virus particles to affect neighboring cells. The other thing that I wanted to say in respect to your previous question is that I also have the advantage, I think it's an advantage at least, of having a doctorate in medical microbiology with an emphasis in virology. So I do understand more than most people, I think it's fair to say, about the behavior of virus particles. I also should mention that in addition to the safety efforts that I make, I also have my old lab ultraviolet lamp in my kitchen that I use to sterilize my gloves and my face mask, only because they're used for a couple of hours every week, and so they can be reused.
Yeah, what do you do?
The other thing that people should understand in respect to ultraviolet light is after exposing themselves possibly to a risky situation, and hopefully, if the sun is out, standing in the sun for 5 or 8 minutes, facing the sun with your eyes closed, and then turning around for the same period of time is a good way to sterilize all surfaces.
Oh, okay.
Ultraviolet light does not penetrate, but it will kill microorganisms on the surface as you face the sunlight.
So you go out at least once a day for that little exposure.
Well, I go out not necessarily for that, but in combination of working with my garden. I have vegetables growing in pots on my deck, and I also have a greenhouse that I built that's attached to my house. And so by working in those two areas, I expose myself, if the sun is out, of course, to enough sunlight to kill what's ever on the surfaces of my skin. And I would emphasize that that's a useful thing for people to do who don't have a UV lamp.
Right, because your UV lamp is actually laboratory quality.
Yes.
And it sounds like something that you use a couple hours a day to shove stuff under inside of a dark room, or you put it right in your kitchen?
It's sitting on the surface, one of the surfaces in my kitchen, so it's easily accessible for me to put my my gloves and my face mask and some other items that I have gotten my mail sometimes.
Right.
Under that UV exposure.
Right. You would even put your cell phone under there.
No, I don't do that. That's too dangerous.
It's too dangerous to do that?
Yes. Well, it's UVC light, which is the most risky. UV comes in 3 flavors, A, B, and C, C being the most deadly as far as danger to your eyes, for example.
Right.
So that you have to avoid that light, to avoid looking at that light, and also looking at surfaces that reflect that light, which many people don't understand. So that's why UV lamps are dangerous in the hands of people who don't understand what that radiation can do.
Right. So do you put on a set of goggles when you turn that light on? Do you put on sunglasses?
You could do that, but because I know after years of working with UV lamps to avoid looking at the rays and to avoid looking at surfaces that reflect it, I have no difficulty in risking any danger of going blind, which would occur if you look directly at that light long enough.
Right, but you must see a lot of people, or even on TV, you must see a lot of things on TV that you just shrug your shoulders saying, these people are taking unbelievable risks. Like the president of the United States is often around a bunch of people that are within 2 feet of him. And sometimes, I guess he's starting to wear a mask now, but mostly he was not wearing a mask. And most of the people around them were not wearing a mask. And it was almost like a badge of Republican Party not to have a mask on, not even have one hanging down from his chin. So you must see stuff on TV that you just shrug your shoulders about, right?
Well, of course, and the president is a good example, but a good example only because, and this is not my opinion, and I've expressed it before in this series of podcasts, but it's also the view of professional psychiatrists and psychologists that the president is mentally ill, and you cannot rationalize with a mentally ill person. So his behavior cannot be taken as an example for good or bad. He requires medical treatment, and he has to be forgiven for all of his irrational behavior and his irrational statements, his chronic lying. You have to forgive him because he's an ill man.
So you would take the view that really the president of the United States should own up to the fact that he's actually suffering from a disease, and he should give up his title as a result, right? You would say that.
Well, one would hope so, but we don't have the machinery in our government to do that. There is I think it's the 23rd Amendment or one of the high amendments that speak to the issue of a president who shows mental failures such that he can manage the office. But that requires, in order to activate that, that would require, from the way that law is written, for his cabinet, I believe, including the vice president, to get together and agree that the president is mentally sick. Well, we see no evidence of that. On the contrary, we see those around the president unable to recognize his mental state, his mental failure, and for reasons that are hard for many people, including myself, to understand, to continue to support an ill person. We should have sympathy for this ill person, but not allow that ill person, because of that state, to govern us. And that's precisely what's happening. That's precisely the reason for many of the sufferings that we're undergoing at this moment from the virus and from other decisions that he has made, irrational decisions, and that have been embraced by his followers who have no understanding of his sociopathic behavior and other aspects of his behavior. It's a tragic situation that hopefully will be resolved on November 3rd. And then we have a serious problem that's also arising now, although it has been referred to several weeks ago, and that is whether he will actually leave office if he loses.
Right.
And whether there is a mechanism that will force him to leave the White House.
Right.
We have no way of knowing. He is hinting that he will take refuge in his belief that the election is a fraud, especially those states and communities that use mail-in ballots. He's setting us up for that eventuality to be used as an excuse for not leaving the White House.
Right. Bill Maher identified this a couple of years ago and people laughed at him, but now I think they're starting to take what Bill Maher said more seriously.
Yes.
That it could be the case that he will set up a big conflict over whether the election really is legit when it is legit, but he just decides to assert it's not legit, and in a strongman kind of way says, you have to drag me out feet first. Now, I don't know exactly how that works. In theory, the FBI or some federal government agency would arrest him and would jail him for trespassing. I guess at minimum it will be trespassing because he no longer have rights to be in the White House. But we have never had a violent transfer of power. Every transfer of power from Washington forward has been a peaceful transfer of power, even when there's been conflict over the legitimacy of the election, as occurred in the Bush 45 scenario, dealing with whether Bush really got elected over Gore. I mean, Gore had the popular vote, but again, the Electoral College went a different way. But let's wrap up on this question, which is, do you think fundamentally, based on all the knowledge and experience you have, that people just don't understand that the virus does not care about you? The virus is a scientific fact of life that exists, and it's not going to care about, well, I did this and I did that, but I didn't do, like grade me for 9 things I do right and 1 thing I do wrong. The 1 thing you do wrong, the virus doesn't care. It's going to penetrate the 1 thing you do wrong. If any link on a chain is broken, the chain is broken, right?
Yes, of course, you've accurately described it. And maybe in our attempt to simplify the concept, we should argue that people should understand the behavior of these virus particles in respect to the common cold, which all of us have suffered from time to time. The common cold virus is, in fact, a member of the coronavirus group. And catching cold is something we all know, we've all experienced. it. There's no vaccine for it, by the way. And that should be instructive in respect to this group of coronaviruses, how difficult it is, especially the common cold, for which are more than 100 varieties or flavors, if you wish, which is one of the reasons why a vaccine against the common cold is so difficult to make. But the common cold attacks people regardless of the work they do, their religion, any aspect of their lives has nothing to do with catching a cold.
Right.
And I think that might simplify the concept of catching coronavirus 19. There's nothing that stands in the way of that other than protecting yourself from this virus, COVID-19, as you would protect yourself from the common cold, which you would do in the same way that we've described here today to protect yourself from the COVID-19 virus. We could all escape the common cold if we all wore masks all the time, if we stayed 6 to 8 feet away from everyone we know all the time, and if we wash our hands and face, hopefully with alcohol, 70% alcohol frequently, common cold catching would disappear.
So you're of the belief that this stuff that I keep here called Purell, it's kind of an expensive version of stuff that's probably not as powerful as your 70% alcohol, right?
Well, I think the Purell has alcohol in it, but I don't think the concentration, you could look at the label now, I think it will tell you the contents and what the percent of alcohol is. But I don't think that percentage of the total volume of the product is 70% alcohol. I doubt that it reaches that level, and so it's risky to depend on that as a sanitizing material.
Yeah, boy, they really sell a lot of this stuff. They really sell a lot of this stuff, and your point probably is you can get something better. I'm just trying to look at the label.
You're better off buying a bottle of 70% alcohol and using that instead. It's fairly cheap and easily available now. There hasn't been a run on alcohol, thankfully. And if your skin is sensitive to alcohol and dries it out, you simply supplement it with the use of a moisturizer from time to time.
I'm looking at the label just because I've never looked at it before. In fact, you cannot even see it. I had to take a picture of it to be able to see it.
That's typical.
And it does say ethyl alcohol is 70% V/V, which must mean volume, right? So they are putting a lot of alcohol, but your point is, well, it's water plus alcohol plus whatever other
glycerol.
stuff.
Oh, well, plus glycerol, I believe. Doesn't it say glycerol?
Right. Plus glycerol. Exactly.
Yeah.
Glycerin.
So whether it's 70% of the total of the glycerol plus the alcohol, or whether it's 70% just of that fraction of the material that consists of alcohol, you don't know with that description.
Right. So when you think about even the basic
the alcohol is much cheaper than that sanitizer.
Right. Like you might say, if you were the CDC, why don't you start with, hey, everyone save money and buy a gallon of just standard alcohol and distribute it into your own little containers. As these things empty out, you can use the same container, right? More or less.
That's exactly what I do with my bottles of alcohol.
Well, let me thank you for coming on the show. I think this has been really helpful. I keep publishing these things because I think every time, and I keep doing them because every time we have another conversation, I get another insight into things you're doing that really are what I would call the perfect model for how to quarantine yourself in the course of a pandemic. And you have created, I think, a perfect model, which in many ways probably should be shown on network TV because you at 90, soon 93 years old, or next 93 years old, in your own house, taking care of yourself, and with really this almost perfect score, if you were bowling like a bowling alley, you're hitting every pin, in my opinion. I don't know what else you could do. You pretty much are doing everything, and most people aren't doing what you're doing. I have to tell you, I think most people have no idea about UV light or even about the use of the sun the way you've suggested it.
Well, unfortunately, it's true for most people, but it shouldn't be, because the rules are well known. The minimum rules are well known. They require very little effort, but people are ignoring them at their own peril.
Yeah. Well, thank you for spending your afternoon with me. I appreciate it. We'll look forward to doing it again. And I'll send some other stuff to you, because I think there's some really interesting stuff now playing out abroad where they say the elite have some sort of solution, but I'm starting to question it. I want to get your comments on it. Maybe we could talk about it on Friday.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Hayflick. Thank you.
Tune in next time on The Valley Current.